Okay, so this lecture will address the clash of cultures on the Great Prairie in the years following the American Civil War. After the Civil War, many Americans turned their energies to the daunting task of settling the western frontier, that vast arid territory that included the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, and the Western Plateau. In the 1860s, the plains west of the 100th meridian had few trees and usually saw less than 15 inches of rainfall per year, which was not considered enough rainfall to support farming. Winter blizzards and hot, dry summers combined to discourage settlement. Yet the open grasslands supported an estimated 15 million bison, or buffalo, which in turn provided food, clothing, shelter, and tools to many of the 250,000 Native Americans living in the West in 1865. In less than 35 years, however, conditions on the Great Plains would change dramatically. By 1900, there was virtually no frontier. The great buffalo herds had been wiped out. Open lands had been fenced in by homesteads and ranches, crisscrossed by railroads, and modernized by new towns. So the period that we think of as the American West, the Wild West, really was only in existence for about 30 years. 10 new western states were carved out of this last frontier, leaving only Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma as territories awaiting statehood. But this progress came at a cost. The rush for the vast natural resources of the West nearly exterminated the buffalo and resulted in serious damage to the environment. Native Americans who happened to be in the way of this development also paid a high human and cultural price. From the point of view of Native Americans, the frontier was their homeland and the source of their livelihood. As this frontier was taken over by white settlers, the Native Americans lost both their land and their freedom to live according to their cultural traditions. The Native Americans who occupied the West in 1865 belonged to dozens of different cultural and tribal groups and included groups such as the Pueblo, the Hopi and Zuni in New Mexico, who lived as permanent settlers raising corn and livestock. The Navajo and Apache of the Southwest were nomadic hunter-gatherers who adopted a more settled way of life, raising crops and livestock, but also produced arts and crafts. In the Pacific Northwest, we see tribes such as the Chinook and the Shasta, who developed complex communities based on the abundant fish and game of that region. But about two-thirds of the western tribal groups lived on the Great Plains. These tribes, including the Sioux, Blackfoot, Cheyenne, and Crow, were nomadic. They had given up farming centuries earlier when the Spanish first introduced horses to their culture. By the 1700s, these Plains Indians had become skilled horsemen. Their ability to travel and hunt more efficiently changed their lives. Their way of life developed around the hunting of the buffalo, and the buffalo became the staple of their very existence. Their tribal organization was loose. While they may belong to a tribe of several thousand, they lived in smaller bands, usually of no more than 300 to 500. Their increased mobility often led to war when hunters in one tribe trespassed onto the hunting grounds of other tribes. For young men, taking part in war parties and raids was a way to win prestige. But a Plains warrior gained more honor by counting coup than by killing enemies. The Plains Indian tribes believed that powerful spirits controlled events in the natural world. Those who showed any signs of sensitivity to the spirits became medicine men or women, shaman. Children learned proper behavior and culture through stories, myths, games, and good examples. Books were not a part of the education of Plains children. No individual was allowed to dominate the communal groups. Tribes were ruled by council rather than by force, and the land was held in common use of the whole tribe. The culture of white settlers differed in many ways from that of the Native Americans on the plains. Native Americans believed that land could not be owned. Settlers believed that owning land, staking a mining claim, starting a business, or establishing a ranch is what gave them a stake in the country as it expanded. Whites argued that Native Americans had forfeited their rights to the land because they hadn't settled down to improve the land. Native Americans saw no need to improve anything about the land. In increasing numbers, white settlers streamed westward along railroads and wagon trails to claim this unsettled land. The prospect of striking it rich was one of the powerful attractions of the West, and the discovery of gold in Colorado in 1858 drew tens of thousands of miners to the region. Merchants and businessmen followed the miners, and soon mining towns boomed in larger cities such as Virginia City, Nevada, and Helena, Montana. The arrival of the railroads on the Great Plains influenced the government's policy towards Native Americans who lived there. In 1834, the federal government passed legislation that designated the entire Great Plains as one enormous reservation, or land set aside for Native American tribes. By the 1850s, the government had changed this policy and created treaties that defined specific boundaries for each tribe. Most Native Americans ignored government treaties and continued to hunt on traditional lands. This led to clashes with settlers and miners, often with tragic results. By 1864, most Cheyenne, assuming they were under the protection of the government, returned to Colorado's Sand Creek Reserve for the winter. There, Colonel John Chivington of the Colorado State Militia was ordered to make the Indians suffer for encroaching on this land. On November 29, 1864, Chivington and his troops launched a dawn attack on about 200 warriors and 500 women and children encamped at Sand Creek. Over 150 Native Americans, mostly women and children, were killed in this battle that became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. North of Colorado, the Bozeman Trail, a major migration route for white settlers, ran directly through the hunting grounds of the Sioux Indians in the Bighorn Mountains. The Sioux chief Red Cloud had unsuccessfully appealed to the federal government to end white settlement along the Bozeman Trail, and tensions between whites and Native Americans increased. In December 1866, the Sioux warrior Crazy Horse ambushed a company of U.S. troops commanded by Captain William Fetterman and Captain George Washington Drummond on Lodge Trail Ridge. 80 soldiers were killed in the battle, which whites refer to as the Fetterman Massacre. Native Americans called the engagement the Battle of the 100 Slain. Skirmishes continued until the government agreed to close the Bozeman Trail. In return for the closing of the trail, the Sioux were forced to sign the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 forced the Sioux to agree to live on a reservation along the Missouri River. The leader of the Hunkpapa Sioux tribe, Sitting Bull, never signed the treaty, and although the Oglala and Brule Sioux did sign the treaty, they expected to continue to use their traditional hunting lands. The treaty provided only a temporary halt to warfare. The conflict between the two cultures continued as settlers moved westward, and Native Americans resisted the restrictions imposed on them. In late 1868, the Kiowa and Comanche began a 6-year raiding spree that would eventually result in the Red River War of 1874 and 1875. The U.S. Army responded to the Kiowa and Comanche threat by herding all the people of friendly tribes onto reservations while opening fire on all others. General Philip Sheridan, a Union Army veteran from the Civil War, gave orders to the Army to destroy their villages and ponies, kill or hang all warriors, and bring back all women and children. Using these tactics, the Army crushed all resistance on the Southern Plains. Within 4 years of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, miners began searching the Black Hills for gold. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho protested the miners' invasion of Indian land to the government, but to no avail. In 1874, Colonel George Armstrong Custer reported that the Black Hills had gold from the grassroots down. A gold rush immediately followed. Again, two Sioux chiefs, Sitting Bull and Spotted Tail, vainly appealed to government officials in Washington. When the Sioux refused to give up their lands in the Black Hills, the government ordered a military expedition under General Alfred H. Terry to remove the Indians. Colonel George Custer commanded the cavalry of this expedition. In early June 1876, Sitting Bull had a vision in which he saw soldiers falling from the sky. Sitting Bull encamped along the Little Bighorn River, where Custer discovered him in July of 1876. Disobeying his orders to wait for the remainder of Terry's troops to arrive, Custer attacked. Led by Crazy Horse and Gall, the Indians retaliated, driving Custer's men back and annihilating almost the entire battalion of Custer's 7th Cavalry. By late 1876, however, Sitting Bull and most of his followers took refuge in Canada, where they remained until 1881. Sitting Bull would be forced to surrender to the government and accept life on the reservation to keep his people from starving. He appeared in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in 1885 just to make money. Native Americans did have supporters in the U.S. government who were ashamed of the government's methods of dealing with Native Americans on the Great Plains. Sympathizers supported a process known as assimilation, a plan under which Native Americans would give up their beliefs and way of life to become part of the white culture. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, which aimed to Americanize Native Americans. The Dawes Act broke up the reservations, gave 160 acres to each head of household and 80 acres to each unmarried adult, and the remainder of the reservations were sold to settlers, resulting in income to be used by Native Americans to buy farm implements. By 1932, whites had taken about 2/3 of the territory that had been set aside for Native Americans, and in the end, the Native Americans received absolutely no money from the sale of this land. Perhaps the most significant blow to tribal life on the Great Plains was the destruction of the buffalo. Tourists and traders shot the animals for sport, often from trains passing through the Great Plains, leaving their carcasses to rot. General Sheridan noted that buffalo hunters were destroying the Indians' main source of food, shelter, clothing, and fuel, making the Indians' life on the plains all but impossible. In 1800, it's estimated that approximately 65 million buffalo roamed the Great Plains. By 1890, fewer than 1,000 remained in a single small herd protected by the U.S. government in Yellowstone National Park. Under the Dawes Act, the Sioux and other tribes continued to suffer from poverty and disease. Out of desperation, they turned to a Paiute Sioux shaman who promised that if the Sioux performed a ritual called the Ghost Dance, Native American lands and way of life would be restored. The Ghost Dance movement spread rapidly among the 25,000 Sioux living on the Dakota Reservation, and it alarmed military leaders who feared that the Ghost Dance was actually a war dance, and they moved to intervene. 40 Native American police were ordered to arrest Sitting Bull on December 15, 1890. Sitting Bull's followers struggled with the Indian police, and in the resulting melee, Sitting Bull was killed. Following Sitting Bull's murder, Chief Bigfoot led the Lakota Sioux away from the reservation. Bigfoot and approximately 350 starving and freezing Sioux were rounded up, ironically, by the remnants of the 7th Cavalry, led by Custer at Little Bighorn, near a place called Wounded Knee Creek on December 28, 1890. On the morning of December 29th, the cavalry commander surrounded Bigfoot's band, ordered them to turn in their weapons. A shot was fired, and to this day, it's unclear which side fired that shot, but the soldiers opened fire with both rifles and artillery. More than 200 Lakota men, women, and children were killed. 30 soldiers were also killed, most likely in the crossfire that resulted from the engagement. Most of the Indian corpses were left to freeze on the ground. Wounded Knee brought the Indian Wars and the life of the Plains Indian to a bitter end.